Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm here with Dr. Will Falconer and Julie Anne Lee. Tonight we're going to be talking about titer testing for dogs and cats. We've got a bit of an agenda tonight. There's some questions that we want to go over. Before we get started, can everyone hear me? Just let me know in the chat. That'd be great. And if you wouldn't mind changing your chat option to all panelists and attendees so that we can all kind of join the conversation. So tonight, like I said, we have an agenda. Things are going to run a little bit differently. If we have time for Q&A at the end, that'd be great. We'll take a couple audience questions. And the topic tonight is titer testing for dogs and cats. And, without further ado, Will, you are a huge, I don't want to say influencer, but you're a pioneer in this industry. You spend your time educating animal owners, helping them raise wildly healthy, naturally disease-resistant animals. I saw on your website you have courses, you have a Facebook page, and you spend a lot of your time really sharing what you know and educating the public to be able to make the best choices for their animals.
True.
So we are
guilty as charged.
Guilty. We're so excited to have you on tonight. This is a hot topic that gets asked a lot in our own Facebook group, and our customer service team is constantly fielding this topic. So we're really excited tonight to have you here. And if we could start the conversation kind of about what is titer testing? Could you start there
Sure.
and kind of tell us about that?
Sure. Forgive me while my electricity goes out for a little bit. I'm on the laptop and that's going to keep working. So
That's
the light will come back in a little bit. Titer testing really is just a measurement stuff of how many antibodies are in the blood. And we can get that in any species. We can they can raise antibodies in a couple of different ways. The most common is we would test an animal we thought was exposed to a disease, an actual disease. So people have probably heard of a Lyme titer. A Lyme titer just says there's antibodies for Lyme disease in this animal's blood. Therefore, this animal was exposed to the Lyme organism and made antibodies. Another way to get a titer is to vaccinate. And that's usually the one that people are tracking nowadays and, spending a lot of time and worry about. And a fair amount of it unnecessary worry and a fair amount of it overspending. We'll talk about that in a bit, and misreading what a titer means. But that's basically all it is measuring the amount of antibody in the blood for a given antigen or a germ, a virus typically, or could be a bacteria, but it's commonly in dogs and cats viruses.
That's super helpful. Julie, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I mean, I'm excited to hear, always excited to hear what Will has to say. And I don't know if everybody knows that Will is coming from India. So he's actually living in India. So if his hydro goes, I can appreciate that, just spending some time there with Rajan Sankar, and how it just isn't the same as here. So we're pretty lucky to have him. And I mean, as far as titers go, I'm so excited to hear from him, because when I opened up my clinic in like 1997, we didn't have any titers in Canada. I had to send all my titers to the US. So Dr. Dave Roosh and I were paramount with Dr. Sally Lester, who was the pathologist at Central Lab at the time, which is now IDEX. And we sort of created the very first canine titer for Canada, like to be able to be done in Canada. Nice. So it's come up. It was really hard, and it was like people thought we were crazy. But first of all, no one's ever going to do them. And they started off doing them Tuesdays and Thursdays only. And then, now we're into like full titer panels and all kinds of wonderful stuff. So yeah, without further ado, I'm just so happy that we can now share even more information and more detailed information, which is really amazing.
Sure.
So I'm just quiet. put myself on mute and just listen. But it's going to be great. It's nice to see you, Will.
You too, Julie. Really nice to see you. I just had as I was soaking my tea, it's some traditional medicinal tea. I just thought I'd share this, like a fortune cookie. They've got a little thing on the string. It says, William Shakespeare is quoted saying, "One touch of nature makes the whole world kin." And I thought, well, it was sweet. It's really the thread that ties us all together. Whether we're teaching stuff or we're learning stuff, we're all interested in what's the natural model, right? What has nature got to share with us that we can learn from and apply to those animals who we've, in a sense, kind of taken out of nature a little bit. We're telling cats to stay in our houses, and we're telling dogs to walk on a leash, or whatever we're doing. We're putting the food in front of them as opposed to them going out and hunting. So we always want to reframe what we're doing and review what we're doing with nature as a backdrop. And that's been my philosophy since the get-go. And we'll use it in this discussion on titers as well, because, for instance, the Lyme titer, if somebody gets a Lyme titer and their animal's healthy and showing no symptoms at all, what does that mean? Oftentimes conventional vets misread that and say, oh, we got to start antibiotics. You're going to get a month's worth of oxytetracycline now because your dog's fighting Lyme. And I go, wait a minute. This is a healthy dog, free of symptoms, and there's antibodies in the blood at a certain number, at a certain level. And you're saying my dog is sick? He's not sick. He's very well, and he's mounting a response, and he should be applauded for staying free of symptoms because he's so healthy. So that's the natural view of things. And the giving antibiotics for a month is foolishness. We're going to kill all the flora in his gut and set his immune system back 40 years. All sorts of things. So anyway, I'll Steph fire some questions my way.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good segue for why is titer testing something we should consider for our animals?
Well, it's a measure of how immune your animal is, so there's two things operant if you're in the world of vaccinations, and you're partaking in that, and many of our listeners are in one way or another. So there's vaccination and there's immunization, and they're two different things. So the hope is that vaccination, the plunging of the syringe and the needle through the skin and squirting in the virus load, will equate with immunization, meaning the animal has now responded to that insult and said, oh, I'm going to make antibodies and I'm going to make killer cells that recognize this, and T lymphocyte cells that have a memory about this thing. And if I ever see that, the dog's immune system might be saying, if I ever see that thing again, I'm going to fight it, and my person or my dog is not going to get sick. But the thing we miss often is that vaccination does not necessarily equal immunization, right? They're two separate acts. One is the act and the other is the response. So the reason we might want to do a titer is to say, did I get my animal immunized after I went through that round of vaccines at whatever age? So it turns out Dr. John Robb has got some proof that we're not immunizing very well if we're doing the vaccines at around 8 weeks of age, right? And breeders often start before that. If they're kind of off in the woods on, I want these pups to be immune before they go home. So they might start at 6 weeks of age, or they might start, some of them have started at 4 weeks of age. I recently put a podcast episode out about that, saying, please stop this. That's foolishness. What we're doing really is only risking the animal's health and not adding any immunization to them. Why? Because mom's antibodies are in place, probably at least until about 12 weeks when they start to taper off, and they're probably gone by 16 weeks. So Dr. Robb says, if somebody tells me they want to get a titer, I'll say, wait till at least 12 weeks. Otherwise, you're wasting your money, because the vaccination that happened early did not result in immunization. There won't be any antibodies there. Mom's antibodies just blocked that vaccine load from causing immunization, from allowing the animal to react and immunize himself from that shot.
That's perfect. Thank you, Dr. Falconer. Can we talk a little bit about what kind of things we can avoid by using titers?
Yeah, if they're used intelligently, titers can avoid excessive vaccination. So the whole idea of vaccinating repeatedly throughout life, just so everyone's on the same page here, there is no scientific basis for that whatsoever. What we have is a label on a vaccine. And guess who put the label on the vaccine? The manufacturers. And if it says repeat it 1 year, what does that really mean? Does that mean the immunization kind of runs out like an empty gas tank at 1 year? No, no, not at all. What it means is they studied this vaccine for 1 year in their test animals. They vaccinated at day 1. They fed them and they housed them and they, took care of them in their cages for, a year's time. And then they pulled them out and they challenged them with the live virus of that same kind that they vaccinated with, the pathogenic virus, the kind that could cause illness. And they counted up the survivors and they said, oh, we got a 70 or 80% survival rate, or they didn't get sick. And therefore, we know this vaccine works for 1 year. They stamp a label on that vaccine and sell it as a 1 year vaccine, whatever it is. They might do the same with 3 years for rabies there's typically a 1 year and a 3 year rabies vaccine. Turns out they're identical. But in the 3 year case, they just studied that lot of vaccine for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, they challenged those animals with live rabies virus, counted up the ones who didn't get rabies and said, we're going to market with a 3 year labeled vaccine. So the trouble with that is that's as far as the science went. And what does the manufacturer want to do? He wants to sell more vaccine, right? And what does a vet want to do? Here's the highest markup item in a practice, and it's why it brings in 20% or more of income. How long does it take to load up a syringe, pick up the skin, and squirt it in to the dog? I mean, 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And what does that dose of vaccine cost? $2, $2.50, something like that. And what is charged? $40, $50, $30, whatever it is. So you can see why people would say, well, I think we should vaccinate every year. We'll keep them safe that way. And the vaccine is labeled for 1 year. So they've kind of got the manufacturer on their side, you might say. So we can use titers to say, has my animal been immunized? And we can think also of what the immunologists talk about, which is this thing called DOI. DOI just stands for duration of immunity. And here's something everybody needs to know, because you'll uselessly spend money on titers if you do them too often. And they won't comfort you, or they won't help you in your need to minimize vaccines. And I think your question really is this: why would we want a titer, or what value might a titer have? A titer can tell us we don't need to revaccinate, bottom line, because there's immunity there. We vaccinated once or twice, we've measured the titer, and we said, there's a bunch of antibodies there. So knowing that, we can say, no, I see you're saying I'm due. I always put that word in quotes. You're due for more vaccines. I'm not going to get them. I'm going to say no. You can tell your vet that. I've got a titer that says my dog's been immunized.
And from there, that's how we avoid the over-vaccination. It's strange to me that they're only testing the vaccines, like you said, for a year, or for like, why aren't they going on the longer and I don't know, actually testing this stuff? The money, follow the money.
There's no money in it. Yeah, they want to sell vaccines. And so they want to rush it to market as quickly as they can. And if they get a 1 year vaccine out on the market and people repeat it every year because they think there's science behind that, everybody makes money except the animals are suffering.
Yeah.
And the deeper question is, why do we want to limit vaccines in our animals? And the key answer there is we're seeing and have seen for decades now. Julie's seen it, I've seen it, everybody in homeopathic practice who cares to look sees damage coming from vaccines. In fact, we can't typically get a patient well if we're good homeopaths without saying, I think vaccines had something to do with this illness. At some point in the prescribing panorama, we've got to get a vaccinosis remedy given that fits this animal's situation, or they don't make it all the way to cure. So vaccine injury is very common.
Even.
Go ahead.
Or an obstacle to cure, like you're
Yes.
treating something and somebody, you know, one person in the family is on board of just doing titers or not vaccinating anymore. Somebody wants to get vaccinated, and then every time you vaccinate them, you're back to square one again. You know, so I would say, you know, it's often a massive obstacle to cure.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's the homeo speak around getting somebody well. There's obstacles to cure. If you're feeding junk food, or the animal's tied to a chain to a tree in the backyard instead of living free and, you know, having a nurturing lifestyle. Those are all obstacles to cure, Hahnemann identified, and vaccines are a huge one.
Yeah.
So whether you're seeking homeopathic treatment or you're just trying to raise a healthy dog or cat who's, you know, resistant to disease, you've got to know that vaccine injury is a very real thing. You'll see it if you look for it.
Definitely. Thank you for explaining that. Can we talk about the limits of titer testing? When we were coming up with the agenda, Dr. Falconer, I think this was your point that you wanted to hit on.
Yeah, it's a real important one. So while I see titers as valuable, I also see them as only part of the story. So let's take the vaccination example again. We vaccinate somebody with a syringe full of viruses, and we want to know, was that animal immunized? Well, it turns out there's two arms to the immunization response. One is called the cellular arm, or cell-mediated immunity is the common term that immunologists talk about. And the other is the antibody arm, or the antibodies, the globulins, that sort of thing that are produced. And what we're measuring is just that one arm of the antibodies. It's impractical and very expensive and only done in high-tech labs to measure the cellular response. But here's the good news. We know that it takes cells to make antibodies. You can't get antibodies just out of the blue by shooting a vaccine in. So it takes a cell to make that antibody, and that antibody appears in the blood. So we can measure that. We can do that affordably, in fact. The prices have come down. If you're not aware of Dr. John Robb and protectthepets.com, you want to get with him if you need a titer affordably. And maybe Julie's got good sources in Canada as well that are affordable now. But vets oftentimes try to charge $300 or more for a titer. So that's an aside. They're affordable if you look in the right places. But the limit is, if you're titering and you believe when the titer falls that my animal is not immune anymore to that disease, then you are likely to say, oh, I need another vaccine because there's not antibodies there anymore. Here's the problem with that. It's not in nature's best interest. Let's go back to nature. It's not in nature's best interest to keep producing antibodies all the time. It's a waste of energy if the disease is not out there. So at a certain point, all titers will fall some years later, typically. They typically last for a long time. You'll see some BS claims by vets who would rather vaccinate your animals saying, oh, titers go up and down and they drop off and they come back and we can't trust titers. No, they'd last a long time, but they will fall at a certain point. So say you vaccinated your animal at 16 weeks and maybe again for good measure a month or two later, or maybe at the year birthday. And you've got a strong titer for the first 5 years. And it starts to drop at year 6, and it's pretty much down to 0 at year 8. Should that senior or coming on senior, now they're calling those dogs seniors, should that dog be vaccinated because the antibodies are gone? No. What we refer to is the immunologist's understanding of this thing called DOI, duration of immunity. So immunity is still there. And the immunologists I quote often are Dr. Schultz and Tom, whatever his name was, I forget now, years and years ago, when I graduated from homeopathy training in '92, said that immunity to viruses persists for years, if not for the life of the animal. Years, if not life, to viruses. So that's important understanding. And when you have that in the background, and you understand that antibody production is a waste of energy at a certain point, it'll happen if there's exposure to disease, but otherwise you don't need it. And you frame that knowing that there's cells that have a memory. Cellular memory is this long-lasting immunity basis. Then you go, oh, okay, his antibodies fell, but that doesn't mean his immunity is gone. It's not like a gas tank that runs out when the antibodies go away. And we've actually got good data. I've got a rabies paper quoted in one of my blog posts about animals who were out of date on rabies. And they were exposed to a rabid bite. And the standard protocol is to give them another rabies vaccine. And some of these animals, interestingly, had low to no titers. But when they were bitten by this animal and then given a rabies vaccine to make sure they're safe, their titers bounced way up and actually got higher than the animals who were up to date and kept up with their shots. So that data spoke volumes to me and to my readers about, so we can make antibodies anew if we need to, if there's an exposure. So that's the limit of antibody titers. They don't tell the whole story. They just tell us one arm of the cellular immune of the cellular antibody response. The cellular immunity is ignored. The other limit, I think, knowing what I've just said, chew on that for a while and review this video later, is that you don't need a titer test every year. Right? A lot of people do that in lieu of vaccination. Well, we titer test every year, and maybe vets are pushing that. I don't know, but I think it's driven largely by consumers. So if you've got a titer, whether it's large or small or in between, after you've let a month go by from a vaccine event, you're pretty well done. You don't need to keep repeating that work and spending that money year after year. Because of what I've just told you, you're just measuring the antibodies and they're going to drop off at a certain point. But if you've got a positive titer in any one of those tests that you've run, typically the first one will tell you, then you know that cellular immunity happened, and that's going to live for a long time.
I'm glad you said about a dog around 8 years of age and stuff, because I think the other thing that we have to look at is risk versus benefits too.
Exactly.
Right? So, you have an 8-year-old dog you've been just doing titers, along the way, or you've even been vaccinating. The majority of the diseases that they're vaccinating for, or a large majority, are almost like childhood illnesses, right? Like the dogs and cats should be past their peak of that risk, right?
Yes.
Compared to, what are the risks and what are the benefits? I would always say to people, when you're looking at an animal, in an aged animal or a senior animal, or an animal going into their senior years, the complications of a vaccine compared to the risk of them even getting the disease, I don't think that I don't even think you can compare them.
Yeah, it's a very risky thing, and I hear regularly from people emailing me and commenting on my blog posts and things like that my 8-year-old or 9-year-old or 10-year-old dog was rocking along just fine, healthy, eating well, shiny coat, good eyes. the notice came for a rabies vaccine. He's due, again in quotes, due for a rabies vaccine. And his whole world fell apart after that rabies vaccine. He may have gotten laryngeal paralysis. He may have gotten rear end paralysis and now be dragging his hind legs. Those are common after rabies. He may have changed his behavior. And not uncommonly, the sad story is they'll circle the drain. These dogs will go right downhill and their life will end, you know, within months of getting that unnecessary rabies vaccine. So yes, the seniors are at far greater risk than they are need for another vaccine. And knowing this about duration of immunity should help you understand that.
Yeah, I think that's important, especially like I think I experienced that with our last dog. Just suddenly, like you said, right down the drain. What the heck is going on? And we could never figure it out. And it happened quickly, and quite honestly, it could be because it likely was because we were over vaccinating.
Yeah, it's all too common, I'm afraid.
I think it happens with people. I mean, my grandma was a prime example. She never got vaccinated for anything, and she lived on a farm, and then my aunts fought with my mom about putting her in a home because she was alone, and like, you know, a senior's home, not a nursing home, and she didn't want to go. But anyways, my mom got voted out, and when she went, they wanted her to have a flu vaccine. And she was 91, and never vaccinated her whole life, robust, not sick. And my mom was like, no way. Anyways, they wound up doing it. And within 48 hours, she never had diabetes. She was perfect. Within 48 hours, she went into a diabetic crisis.
Wow.
From this, there was nothing else that was different. Like nothing. Nothing, not a sick day, healthy as a horse.
Wow.
And my mom was like, there you go, you know, and they're like, well, it had nothing to do with the vaccination. It's like,
yeah.
You know, and then she would have things, you know, it just went like a little bit of a spiral, right?
Yeah.
Getting insulin, getting her regulated. It's like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it oftentimes the side effects that you see aren't side effects that are typically on the side effects of the drug, right? Like if you look up, oh, what's the side effect of a vaccination, right? Well, most of the time it's acute side effects, or all the time, you know, within the first 24 to 48 hours, 3 days off their food, you know, seizures, blah, blah, blah. But they all only assume that that's going to happen within that very short acute period of time. Whereas in my experience, you know, they can maybe be a little off in that first period of time, but then it starts happening, you know, a couple weeks later, you know, a month later, you start really seeing, you know, degenerative diseases happening.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think the homeopaths, just for everyone listening, I think it's really important that you keep that in mind. If you haven't seen a vaccine reaction in the first 48 hours, that doesn't mean you're out of the water, out of the hot water. So keep watching. And if you've got an animal who's gotten chronically ill, the commonest being allergies of one form or another, they're itching you know, they can't stop itching, or their ears are inflamed. Look back. And in the records, in the vet records, which are yours to examine, you'll often see that started about a month after a vaccine was given, whether it was, you know, at youth or after puppy vaccines or whatever. So another colleague of ours, Christopher Day in the UK, longtime practicing homeopath, a vet there, interviews his people who come to him with an itchy dog and say, when did this itch start? Do you remember a beginning to it? And 80% of them over the years with his informal survey have said, oh, I remember it clearly. It was about a month or two after the puppy shots. So unless we're tuned to watch for that, we'll miss it. And conventional vets can easily blow that off and say, oh, no, if it didn't happen in 48 hours, the vet doesn't, or the vaccine doesn't get the blame. Well, we know better. We've seen it for years and years.
It's all connected. Yeah. What do you guys say? Can we move into Q&A? We've got quite a few here.
I'm fine.
Yeah, would that be okay?
Sure.
This one we see a lot. So I'm curious, Dr. Falconer, how you feel about this. April's asking, how can we handle a rabies titer if it's not recognized in our state what the vaccine is? And we could even go a little bit more general. How do we, if the vaccine's recognized but the titer's not, what do we do?
Yeah, it's a thorny question. I've got an entire course called Rabies Knowledge is Power that addresses that. So it's not a simple answer, but I want to assure you that people have found ways. So part of your education can be just going to vitalanimal.com and searching for duration of immunity. There's a search box on all the articles off to the right-hand side. Just search on duration of immunity, and you'll bring up an article called Rabies, Duration of Immunity and Rabies, something like that. Those words are in the title. And if you read the comments on that post, you'll see many, many people who have successfully sidestepped that excessive rabies vaccination question. And they'll give you some ideas about how they did it. So that's a snippet of the course where I go deeper into, how to understand rabies, how to understand rabies prevention, and strategies for either minimizing it if you've got to, minimizing damage if you've got to give it, or better yet, avoiding it altogether.
Stephanie, did you put that in the chat?
Yeah.
Because I think that's really, really important. People really have to have that sort of that foothold in the education to be able to stand in front of whomever to really speak from an educated place of why they don't want it, or why they want to just do a titer, or whatever it is. But I think the more education that a pet parent has, the stronger the possibility is that you're going to be able to sort of speak the language more, be able to communicate more, and inevitably get what you want and what's best for your animal.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that in saying it's really confidence that you want to inculcate. So the more you learn about it, the more confident you are. So just learning about this thing called duration of immunity is a huge, powerful point to have in your consciousness. That virus immunity lasts a long time. It doesn't go away in a year. It doesn't go away in 3. So I'll give you an example of a client of mine in Austin where I practiced for years. She's now, I think, on her 4th or maybe 5th generation of really healthy, vital dogs. She wants to know her heartworm status, and she goes into a conventional vet to get that work done. Every year, I believe. Maybe she's slowed down now. It's been a couple of decades since she was doing this and told me about it. She goes in, she says, "Hi, I'm here for my heartworm test, please." And they pull the blood on these dogs and test them for heartworm. Oh, they're negative. Still doing Dr. Falconer's protocol. They're negative. And they've learned not to ask her about rabies vaccine, because it says on the record they're out of date for rabies vaccines, because she smiles every time they ask in the past. She smiles and says, "No, that's all we're here for." And it's a very confident smile. She knows what she knows, that they're immune, and she doesn't get into an argument about anybody, but she's strong. She stands strong and says, "No, thank you. That's all we're here for, is the heartworm test. How much do I owe you?"
Yeah, I think that's really important. I do, rather than getting into any kind of conflict at all, and just saying, I appreciate, I'm here because I appreciate the what working as a team. That I always say that to people, that you, when you walk in the door, you're part of the healthcare team. You're not walking in less than or more than. You're walking in as an equal.
I love it.
And that means that you respect your, practitioner for what they're bringing to the table, but then the same should hold true for you, and what you've educated yourself to learn. And it's like you said, the confidence level and the understanding is I think really prime.
Yep, yep. When you own that and you say, I'm the one who's in charge of my animal's health, and I appreciate your help, Dr. Whitecoat, or whoever your vet is. I appreciate your help when I need it. But I'm calling the shots on my animal these days because I've really studied these issues. And I know vaccine immunity lasts a long time. So yes, I know there's a law. You don't have to get into the nuts and bolts of immunity, but you can just say, I've studied this and I'm very confident that my dog is still immune or my cat is still immune.
You said you had a heartworm protocol. Do you have that on your site as well? Okay.
Yeah, that's a searchable term too, just heartworm. Yeah.
Okay, great.
And I'll post your website again so that everyone can jot it down or click the link and go.
Thanks, Steph.
Yeah, you're welcome. I've got another question here. Someone says, ask Dr. Will this. What do vets do for rabies? They have to have immunity, but I know they don't get vaccinated every year, every 3. So what do the vets do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll tell you a funny story. A colleague of ours in upstate New York, Cynthia Lankanow, we all got vaccinated for rabies in vet school. It was protocol. And I think we got it probably twice. And Cynthia was curious about her titer. So she measured it periodically. And a decade later, it was still high and it was actually climbing. She hadn't gotten any more rabies vaccines since the days of vet school. A decade later, when she measured 2 titers, the second one was higher than the first. So it was still climbing for quite some time. So we know, as do MDs who don't vaccinate their children. MDs, if you ask MDs point blank, do you follow the schedule, the CDC mandates for children vaccines? They will say, no, I do not. So we know, they know that immunity is a long-lasting thing, and we're not vaccinated for rabies. I would not even consider it living in India now, were I to join the volunteers who go into the field and vaccinate whole villages full of wild dogs and feral dogs and owned dogs as a means of controlling rabies. I would, in a situation like that, take Listen periodically, the no-sode made from rabbit saliva, to protect myself. I wouldn't vaccinate myself again. I know too much and I've seen too much damage. I myself have had vaccine damage and I don't want to repeat that. So it's a great question.
Killer answer too. Thank you. There's a question here. So if mom never fed her puppies, will they not have mom's immunity?
Correct. That's why everybody who's raising animals pays so much attention to getting colostrum in. And here's something many don't understand, which is that colostrum is only absorbed in about the first 12 to 16 hours of life. So when those babies hit the ground, whether they're a foal or a calf or a piglet or a dog or a cat, a kitten or a pup, a smart breeder of those animals will know we've got to make sure this youngster latches on and gets a good nursing full of colostrum. So yes, you'll see sickness if they do not. And it's a hard road to just replace that with, some milk replacer or even a colostrum supplement later on, because that first milk and that absorptive capacity of the child's gut or of the youngster's gut is only high for that first 12 to 16 hours of life.
That's great. Thank you. Julie, did you want to add there?
And I think, just because gut health and stuff is such a big thing with me, they also, a lot of animals that aren't, dogs anyways, that aren't fed often that way are animals that have gone through C-sections. And So they're getting a double whammy because they're not getting the vaginal bacteria as they're coming out, because that bacteria is massive with antibodies. And I think it's really important for anybody that knows if their animal hasn't had colostrum or has been birthed through a C-section to be paying attention to that.
Never
And
thought of that. So they're not somehow getting a lot of milk out of the mom and giving it to those pups?
lots of times they don't. I know a lot of breeders that have, when they have C-sections, they just automatically go to formula.
Wow.
So they're getting
That's
it twice, right? They're not getting the antibodies
wow.
through vaginal birth, and then they're not getting antibodies from the milk. So they're
Wow.
really needed. Yeah, I know a lot of bulldogs and Frenchies and things like that, which are pretty common, are often replaced, like milk replacement fed. So
Wow.
that's a biggie.
Yeah.
All right. Many of them have allergies too. They have health issues.
Yeah, they do.
Uh,
A
I
lot.
believe it.
yeah. This question, excuse me if we've already answered it, but it's coming up quite a bit. Maybe it's worth repeating. When do we start titering? Someone's got a 7-month-old pup. Gail's asking, do we titer more than once? Jackie's saying that she titers yearly. Maybe I'm overdoing it. So could you kind of go over that again, if you wouldn't mind, please?
Sure. So a valid time to get a titer is about a month after you've finished vaccinating. Whether that's a vaccine, the vaccine's got to be given probably after that 12-week mark to give immunity. And so if you measure the titer at 16 weeks after a 12-week vaccination, you'll see something on the test. And an aside is some vaccines will have a number associated with them. That's the protective number. Dr. Schultz has said, and Dr. Rob, has brought it out in my podcast episode with him, that it's like a pregnancy test. If there's any number that's greater than 0, that's a positive titer. They're either immune or they're not. So you're either pregnant or you're not on the test. You're either immune or you're not. If you've got a number over 0, it counts. Okay, so don't buy it's too low, we've got to revaccinate. But I'll reiterate that what he said also was animals who were vaccinated before 12 weeks and titered at 12 weeks oftentimes didn't have antibodies because mom's antibodies were in the way. They blocked the vaccine from immunizing the pup. So whenever you are done with your vaccine regimen, if you're going to do vaccines, give it about a month and then titer. But you can do it later than that. It's not going to disappear, right? If there's a titer at a month, there's going to be a titer at a year of age. And there's going to probably be a titer. If that was a good titer, it's probably going to still be there at 3 years of age. So yes, to the yearly, unnecessary. Again, this thing called duration of immunity is key. And you want to search that term out. Duration of immunity is a well-known entity. So if you've got a positive titer, you're really done. You can stop spending money on titers because you know this thing called duration of immunity is there.
I've even read some studies where when they're vaccinated, when the maternal antibodies are still present, that they can actually collide, and the puppy winds up, or kitten winds up, not having any immunity. So the mother blocks it, but it can also, I've also heard that sometimes it can degrade the mother's immunity. Have you ever heard that?
I haven't. It's an interesting thought. I'd like to hear Schultz talk about that. The number one reason those guys all point out, the immunologists all point out, that there's vaccine failure is because they vaccinated too early.
Yeah.
And the mom's antibodies just blocked it. So that's the number one reason vaccination does not equal immunization. So don't start too early.
And I know that we were doing lots of titers initially at our clinic, and we had a few dogs that were anywhere between 5 and 7 that had been getting vaccinated every single solitary year, and we did titers on them, and they didn't have a titer. They'd like 0.
Interesting.
And I remember Dave, Dr. Roosh, saying, you know, I think that, and then people would go and revaccinate them, and then a year later they would get a titer and it would be 0 again. And Dave often said to me, I wonder how often that's happening. I wonder how often dogs are just going in routinely and being vaccinated and they're not mounting a response. They're just like, if it's not happening, it's not going to happen. Like, for whatever reason, because we don't do that, right? We don't go, okay, we're going to vaccinate and then let's see next year whether he needs it or not, and then go from there. I wonder how many would actually have a zero titer, but they're still not getting sick. They're still not getting the virus from innate immunity, or I don't know. I think it's just also fascinating.
Yeah. There's a thing called non-responders,
Mm-hmm.
and that may be what we're talking about here. But I think that's a fairly small minority compared to the majority who do respond.
Yeah, but I think what he was saying too is like, how do we, rather than, he just doesn't think from a science point of view to just routinely do it without seeing if they're even responding, period. And how
Right.
they would learn so much if that was the protocol, vaccinate and then the next year do a titer to see whether they responded at all. And if they did, then they don't need it anymore.
Right.
So yeah, it's so.
And I think there's hope on the horizon for people who are facing rabies laws. You know, depends on where you live, but most of the United States, and I think the majority of provinces in Canada, have some sort of a rabies ruling. The really golden news on the horizon is that just within I think late 2019, Delaware, the state of Delaware, okayed a license if you had a positive rabies titer, period. You could waive the next vaccine if you had a positive titer. So if you're at all an activist and you want to get your state or your province on that same page, Delaware will share their information with you. You can find it by searching, and you can take it to your legislators and say, there is no reason on God's green earth that we need to vaccinate for rabies as often as we're doing it. Here's a state who recognizes these things called titers, which we have decades worth of science about, which make perfect sense. And Dr. Rob has some stuff on that in his episode. I think it was episode 3 on the Vital Animal podcast. You can listen to that, and I've got some links in the show notes there to help those people who want to change their laws. That's really great work if you are up to it.
That's super helpful, and it's nice to know that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Like, people are working towards making changes and making a difference and making the best choices for our animals. Really, it's nice to hear. I've got a question from Terry, and quite a few of these questions are duplicates, and there's 3 and there's 4 of the same question. She works in the rescue industry, and she's asking if you have any advice on what to do about the aftermath after these animals are over vaccinated. Some of them are fighting for their lives. How do we help them once something like this has already taken place?
Yeah, it's a very sad industry, and I'd love to see more people. I think there's a small handful of people in the rescue industry who are aware of these principles and are working homeopathically or using titers minimally to check their animals that end up on their doorstep. So the norm now is that animals who end up in a rescue of one sort or another, or a shelter of one sort or another, are blindly vaccinated when they arrive. It's like overkill. And it'll probably take not only mind changing and understanding on a lot of these places in their minds, the management's minds, but also maybe someone to come forth and say, I'm going to pop for a year's worth of titer testing for your shelter because it breaks my heart that these animals are damaged by vaccines over and over again. And if they tested them, you know, with a simple in-house test right there in the shelter when they arrived and said, oh, there's antibodies for distemper and parvo, or if it's a cat, there's panleukopenia antibodies. There's a positive titer. This animal doesn't need a vaccine. That in itself would solve so many issues in these poor animals who are already stressed. You know, they've been abandoned, they've been living on the street perhaps, they're undernourished. To pop them with a slew of vaccines when they arrive on the doorstep is just anathema. It's malpractice is what it is. So I don't have a one-size-fits-all for vaccine damage. I treat those animals individually. There's probably 20 remedies for vaccinosis, and I don't automatically reach for one and say this will cure everybody. Julie's got a product, and maybe she'll speak to that might be a help in those shelter cases.
We have you. I mean, that's the product that I have, or we have. It came from a shelter because of shelters, because we did a lot of work. Like I did a lot of pro bono stuff in Vancouver with shelters, tons, and it was virtually impossible to do every animal individual. Like, I mean, the Vancouver Orphan Kitten Rescue, they rescued over 1,800 kittens a year. So, you know, and I was in the downtown east side and did all kinds of dogs down there. Like it's impossible for, and I had, you know, 3 interns and stuff working with me, and we just couldn't keep up. And it was impossible to convince a lot of shelters not to do it. It was just brutal. But I'm gonna you just sparked something in my head. So it's just basically it's a combination of thuy and silica. That's which I found to be very helpful for fairly acute symptomatology from vaccinations. But what I did do with a lot of shelters is I tried to train the staff to recognize aconite or agnasia. And when they first come in, try and at least reduce their cortisol or their stress levels before they got vaccinated. I found that was helpful, so that they weren't as scared or sad or stressed or whatever prior to being vaccinated. But yeah, I mean, we right now for shelters, we just give that remedy to shelters. So if anybody's working at a shelter and they want some of the anti-vaccinosis, we for charities, we will just give it to them to use. Because I believe so strong in it. I believe that that's half the reason that they go back, and it's half the reason that some of these shelter animals, like how do they get so healthy? I see these healthy dogs being rescued from like meat farms, right? And the photographs of them before they come over here, they've got all of their fur and they're skinny, but they look vital and whatever. They come over here, and a month later they have no hair, and they've got elephant skin, and they're itching their ears till they're bleeding. Well, it's because they've been vaccinated, like, you know, I don't even know, 3, 4, 5 different times before they get over here. And probably most of those animals have, like, I found that with ferals, right? Ferals or a lot of strays, they've already got tons of antibodies. They've been living out in the streets. They've been fighting these diseases on their own. And then they get on top of that, they're stressed, they're captured, and they're vaccinated, and they're sent by a plane, or they're sent, like, it's just overwhelming for me to see all that. But I wonder if some of the SNAP tests of some of the companies wouldn't donate or you know, and I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know.
I mean, I think that would be a really handy thing to have right there at the incoming, you know, processing. Just run a snap test, run a card test, whatever they call it.
Yeah.
I don't see the company shelling out to do it. There's no financial interest, but you know, we've got a lot of wealth in the West, and there's bound to be people who, if they understood this, have enough wealth to just say, you know, I love this shelter and love what they're doing. I'm gonna donate titer testing for every animal that comes in for the next year. I mean, how much would that be out of their annual budget? Not much.
No, no.
It's doable.
I'll work on that.
Can we do one more here?
Sure.
Yeah.
And pardon me if we've touched on it already. If a titer is showing no antibodies, how do you know if they still have immunity or not?
Well, that goes back to the cellular immunity that we cannot
Right.
measure without being in a laboratory. So if there was a positive titer at one point, that says that there's cellular immunity also. The cells made the antibodies. And that cellular memory is what we count on to provide immunity for a long, long time, for years, if not for life. So we know that's in the background, even if the titer drops to 0. That's with your permission, I'll drop a link in the show notes. I see I can do that for
Please do.
an article I've called The Fallacy of Titer Testing. Let's see if I can remember the abbreviation here.
So, Will, would you say though that anything above 0, because I know a lot of titer tests, they have a cutoff point where it's positive or negative. So if it's not totally 0, or if it's you know just above 0, so very, very low titer, you would say that that's still safe, right?
Yeah. The simplest way to say it is it's yes or no question, just like pregnancy.
Pregnancy. Yeah.
Yep. If there's any number at all, the tricky part comes in reading a little bit, because they'll say they'll have a cutoff point, like you say, some of these labs, and they'll say your animal comes in at less than 0.5, and that could mean 0, but they don't say it. But it's less than whatever their cutoff point is. So that's not a yes or a no. That just says we don't know if it's 0 or if there's a little bit and we didn't measure that low of a dilution to know. So you're in a little bit of shaky ground if you say that's 0, or maybe it's you know 0.3 and they didn't measure 0.3. But most times you'll see some positive titer, low or no, you know, low or high, doesn't matter. And if you've seen that once in their history, you can count on years of immunity, if not lifetime, according to the veterinary immunologists. That's what you can take home with you.
Is the person you were thinking about Peter Phillips?
Tom Phillips, yes. Tom Phillips and Ron Schultz. Yeah.
Their original research was incredible. I can't find it.
Yeah, I've got a copy on my site somewhere. It's in Current Veterinary Therapy. I think it's volume number 11. And I quote it on my site. I'll just drop the link into the efficacy.
I think if you try to search, you used to be able to search for it and find it online. And I don't think you can now.
That could be. There's a link to an article on efficacy, and it's got their quote from it. But yeah, Current Veterinary Therapy, it's a textbook, you know, so it comes out every 4 years in latest and greatest edition. To my knowledge, it's not something that's, you know, put up online. It's for sale. So that may be the reason.
That's too bad.
Yeah, it's available for purchase, but it's a big purchase.
The other thing I wanted to mention really quickly too is the Merck manual. And I used to say to people where if you look on the vaccine pamphlets and it says do not vaccinate animals in ill health or something like that. I can't even remember what it is.
Only for use in healthy dogs, cats, ferrets.
Right. And then if you go into the Merck manual and you look at what that means, the majority of animals right now shouldn't be, based on that, shouldn't be getting vaccinated, because they aren't, according to the Merck manual, healthy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the other thing. If your animals have anything like Cushing's or allergies or IBD or, you know, separation anxiety, all of that is considered, they aren't healthy. So typically they shouldn't be getting vaccinated if they aren't really healthy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I've got an article on that as well. If you look up the word waiver on my site, that's an automatic waiver. So if they're on a special diet, why are they on a special diet? Because they're ill. If they're on a thyroid medication, every I think they give it daily. Why are they on a thyroid medication? Because their thyroid is sick. So all of those things are ignored in conventional practice. They say, well, he's not got a fever today. There's no snot running out of his nose. He's healthy. No, that's not true. We've got chronic disease that throws up symptoms regularly, or they're on medication, or they're getting stuff squirted in their ears every day, or they're on prednisone, or whatever they're on. That's all indications that they're not well. So following the label is something that every physician, every veterinarian is supposed to do. Many don't, but the label says only for use in the healthy. That's on every vaccine. Good reason not to vaccinate if you're impugned to get a vaccine. Say, well, sorry, but my animal's not healthy. I know it's not good to vaccinate ill health.
That's great, because that's some more ammo for us that are still working on building the confidence to speak as an educated owner, and have the guts to go in there and know what we're talking about. So that's super helpful as well.
And
to know that.
And don't forget, for everyone that's still listening, to go onto Will's site, because I think, I really do think it's important for, we're all here, we're in a group, there's, 100 people here, and I don't know how, 100 people on Facebook right now live watching. And the energy when we're all together gives us a lot of confidence, and it gives us, that group feeling. But when you're standing by yourself at the front lobby, and you have to say no, you can remember what you learned on Will's site, and sort of stay in that grounded feeling.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's a really valid thing. You want to also surround yourself with people of like mind. They say we're all the product of the 5 people that are closest to us in life. So if you're hanging out with people who don't buy what we're talking about, you may want to consider hanging with people who do. So you can compare notes, so you chat together, so you support one another. And just having that cluster of people of like mind with you that understand what, maybe conventionally minded folks don't, that in itself is a huge help.
Amazing. Thank you both for hanging out with us tonight. And Dr. Will, thanks for getting up so early to be here with us. We really appreciate it. Such an awesome session. Like you said, Julie, full of energy and just really empowering. It's super valuable, and we're grateful that you two are willing to hop on, spend your time with us, and share what you know.
Yeah, and we're in a very lucky time right now where, I know when Will started and when I started, like, there was nothing to support anybody, really, was there? Like, we were trying to teach people things that there wasn't a lot of support. So now, now when we have sites like Will's site, and we can take advantage of that education, I think it's addictive, and I think not addictive for ourselves, but I think it's contagious.
Yes.
When you're sitting, like you said, even if they're not fully like-minded, but they're sitting on the fence, and you can have a conversation over a cup of tea about what you've learned, right? And you have that that excited energy and that you know, being overwhelmed, not overwhelmed, but it's okay. You know, just when you have that aha moment, that can be very contagious. So thank you so much for putting that site together and allowing, you know, people to be able to get educated to support their animals, and hence support really the whole planet, really, because we're all connected, animals, plants, people.
We are microbiomes, little tiny bacteria in our guts outnumbering our own cells. Thanks for inviting me, Julie. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It was so great to see you.
Thank you,
Bye
everyone, for
now.
joining us. Good night, everyone.